So we can see here on this car, this has the standard folding soft top setup fitted, completely bog standard roof. Where the pivot point is here, there's a large hex fixing, 6mm. It's an M10 thread, but 6mm Allen key. And there will be a couple of steel spacing washers on the back of here. Sometimes they rust together, can be a little bit tricky to get that out, but it is just an M10 fixing through into a brass bobbin in the body. Similar sort of thing around the back. These are obviously smaller. 4mm Allen key needed for these, and on this car there's 5. Also, don't forget a pair of 13mm domed nuts holding the struts to the underside of the header. Once those are removed, the struts will just drop away. Don't forget also, on the top of here, just hiding underneath the canvas, there's a self-tapper at each corner. The one on this side might be a bit easier to see actually, if I can get the camera in there. Just hiding under the canvas. So if the lower rail of the soft top doesn't come away, check for those, just hiding. And lastly, obviously there is the wiring to disconnect, which can be disconnected behind that carpeted panel there. But that's where the high level brake light and the interior LEDs get spliced into the loom as well. So that wiring will end up getting cut, and waterproof connector fitting in. So don't worry too much about having to cut that. The only other difference is, when you're removing these for the first time, you will need an assistant in the boot with a spanner, 10mm spanner on the nuts on the back. But when the new rear deck finisher gets fitted as part of the hardtop conversion, again it uses similar sort of fixing with a cupped washer, but they go into riv nuts. The best thing you can do when you've got this panel off is just insert riv nuts into the existing holes, so you can refit the soft top if you need to without needing an assistant in the boot. And it also makes fitting the hardtop easier. You can interchange between the two. So one thing worth noting, if it's an early car, up until around 95, 96, something like that, the lower half, the lower section of the soft top will actually be bolted through vertically into the rear deck. It's not secured horizontally like the later cars. So when you remove the soft top, you'll find a hole on each corner, probably around here somewhere, another one in the centre. Those will need filling in, smoothing out, and then a good way of getting around having to respray the rear deck and the wing tops is to just neatly mask out and spray a neat black border for the hardtop rubber to sit on, and it cures the problem of the visible holes as well. In any case, if it's a later car or an early car, if it's had paintwork previously on the rear wings and the soft top hasn't been unbolted and removed, you could find an unsightly masking edge in this area. So that's another reason to use a black border if you need to. It's not a problem if the car's having bodywork done at the same time. A respray, you can just paint right up to the top. But other than that, a neat black border fixes both those problems. So after removing the soft top, the first job now is to fit this deck trim panel in place. Bolts around the rear bulkhead. There's 6 fixings along the back there, going into riv nuts into the rear bulkhead. It comes pre-drilled and countersunk at the side there for the main, what would have been the pivot bolt, but obviously this just bolts solidly in place. It's countersunk so it sits flush, and when this panel is bolted in position, the catches can be lined up and the hardtop tension down on the car. The first job is to fit this L-section rubber to the top edge of the rear deck. The top 20mm of carpet will need cutting away from the rear bulkhead to allow this rubber to sit in place.
If the black border has already been painted, then this can be super glued down. Otherwise, just test fit it in place. Use strips of masking tape just to hold it in position if necessary. Remember that the fibreglass rear deck trim panel needs to fit neatly up to this rubber. There needs to be enough space for this rubber to sit between the top of the deck edge and the fibreglass trim panel.
So now the soft top has been completely removed, this rear deck trim panel can go in place. Just bolts through using the same fixing points as the original soft top pivot. Bolt it in place both sides. Then it can be lined up around the rear, and the pre-drilled holes can be drilled right through into the bulkhead. Then they can be opened out and some M6 rib nuts installed. So now we've got the rear deck finisher panel temporarily bolted in place. We're at the stage where we can place the bare hardtop onto the car and just see how it sits. So for the time being, it just uses temporary sections, small sections of rubber, rather than putting the full rubber on at this stage. Just some small sections like that, just to see how the hardtop is sitting, just checking the compression of the rubber, which is nice. It should just sit on the car really nicely. It's also another opportunity to mark out the outline of where the black border needs painting, if it does. So with these short sections in place, the hardtop will sit on the car, and as long as you make sure that the front edge here is in line with the door at both sides, that should pretty much be sitting in place. So now we can line up the side catches. Two really important things to check before trying to set up the side catches. Firstly, there needs to be a gap under here. That's probably about 5 or 6 mil. That will close up because ordinarily that would normally be trimmed in acoustic carpet, which I've yet to do on this one. But when it is trimmed, that gap will close by maybe 1 millimetre or so. And remember that when it's pulled down on the rubber, when the rubber compresses, it'll get a bit tighter as well. You only need a few millimetres, but there does need to be a gap there. If there isn't, this is too high, or it either needs shaving down on the top there. It's not unusual to have to trim the edge of this just to make it fit the car. Again, flat disc on a sander, grinder, take it down, fill it, shape it if necessary, but make sure there is a gap there. Now you can see here I've marked on 90 degrees from the angle of the window or the angle of the top of the rear wing. True vertical would be like this. You don't want the catches to hang at true vertical. They need to be at 90 degrees to the top of the rear wing. So more angled back towards the car slightly, like this. Remember also, when tensioning the catches, the rubber needs to be compressed. There needs to be downwards pressure on the hardtop. Get an assistant just to hold it down. Remember the 90-degree rule, and then make sure the handle is open at 45 degrees, and this will indicate where the holes need drilling. Now don't worry too much about adjustment at the moment, because this hook can be adjusted up and down as well. So you do get further adjustment afterwards, but initially have it on its lowest setting, open at 45 degrees, and mark the 3 fixing holes. Now the rear catchers are different to the side catchers. For a start, they're mounted the other way up, so the catch is mounted to the hardtop and the hook is mounted lower down, rather than the other way up like they are on the side catchers. It's also a sprung catch as well. When setting these up for the first time, the handle wants to be open maybe 70, 80 degrees, something like that, not quite 90. But you do get quite a lot of spring tension on these as well, so the adjustment isn't that critical as long as it snaps tightly closed. Now it is mounted in some elongated slots as well, so that can be easily adjusted up and down to get the right amount of tension. But as long as they snap closed, then the tension's right. The other reason for using sprung catches as well is when the aluminium roof struts are engaged and straightened out, the spring tension helps to keep the struts locked out in place. You don't get the rattling of that moving. The catch is pulling in the same direction as the strut, so it's keeping it in its locked out position.
Now, a few things to note when drilling the side catches for the first time. Ignore the fact that this trim panel has already been covered in vinyl. That comes at a later stage, but for now I just wanted to include this clip just to mention that the 3 self-tapping screws that secure the side catches to the trim panel, they need pre-drilling, but with the correct size drill bit. I know it sounds obvious, but if you use a drill bit which is too small, when you are inserting the screws for the first time, they could bind, they could tighten up. They're not really going to cut their own thread unless the hole is the correct size. If it is too small, it could end up fracturing the fiberglass. You don't want that. So use a drill bit which is 0.5 millimeter narrower than the width of the screws. Pre-drill the holes, and then a good tip is just to smear a little bit of Vaseline along the threads and then enter them in for the first time, and then they'll cut their own thread. It'll make fitting the catches on final assembly a lot easier too. So with these side catches screwed in place and adjusted, the next job is to grind the flanges at the side of the hardtop where the header rubber sits up to the door glass.